Welcome to the online module for moral injury in emerging adults with child welfare histories. Our research has two parts. In Module 1, we will present a quantitative analysis of the moral injury event scale, or what we call the MEAS. And in Module 2, we will describe life stories of young adults who have experienced moral injury. My name is Bailey Jader, and I'm a licensed graduate social worker and one of the members of the research team that produced this project. The rest of our team includes Wendy Haight, professor and Gamble-Skogmo chair at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work; Minhae, professor at Memphis University; Linda Kingery, professor at Simmons University and retired licensed clinical social worker; Ndilimeke Nashandi and Ruth Soffer, both PhD candidates and graduate research assistants at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work. We're grateful for the financial support of the Gamble-Skogmo Endowment and federal Title IV-E funding through the Minnesota Department of Human Services and the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. This module will provide an overview of the meaning of moral injury. We will describe our research of morally injurious events that occurred in childhood and adolescence as narrated by 28 emerging adults with histories in child welfare involvement, and we will discuss the contributions of the MEAS and life histories. Moral injury is defined as the psychological, social, and spiritual harm caused by events in high-stakes situations that oftentimes transgress deeply held core moral beliefs and expectations. Events that may result in moral injury include things like wartime atrocities, rape, other forms of violence, and child abuse. If this occurs, a person may experience intense and persisting feelings of guilt, shame, rage, depression, loss of trust, and a sense of betrayal. Lack of meaning and emotional distress can persist for years and may even impede well-being. Originally, moral injury was a term developed to characterize responses of individuals in military contexts. However, we now understand it is relevant in characterizing the vulnerability of individuals in other socio-cultural contexts as well. In our research, we focused on emerging adults to examine moral injury in childhood and adolescence. Research shows that youth aging out of the foster care system are among the most vulnerable of emerging adults. Some youth describe suffering from repeated violations of their fundamental sense of right and wrong. And prior to entering care, many experience maltreatment such as physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, as well as neglect and abandonment by adults who are morally obligated to care for and protect them. Many of our participants also experience inadequate support from professionals working within systems that oftentimes are under-resourced and also that are entrusted with protecting and supporting them. Previous research also studied moral injury as it pertained to parents and professionals involved within the child welfare system. Parents and professionals both reported high levels of moral injury. They described harm to themselves occurring through unfair laws and policies, an adversarial child welfare system, systemic biases, harm to children by parents, and poor quality services. They also communicated feelings of anger, sadness, guilt, and shame. Some described troubling existential issues, such as professionals asking questions like, why is all of this awful stuff happening? Parents also reported feeling vulnerable and attacked, and professionals questioned how to act as ethical and moral workers within a system that they viewed as deeply flawed. Many professionals noted either themselves or colleagues as actively seeking employment elsewhere, and parents believed that moral injury inhibited their abilities to engage in services necessary for family reunification. Previous studies also show that moral injury is a burden foster children and youth may carry with them into adulthood. Prior to entering foster care, many experience maltreatment such as physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, as well as neglect and abandonment. Many have also experienced poverty, exposure to drug and alcohol disorders, and domestic violence. Once a youth is in foster care, many experience multiple temporary placements with unrelated adults who may not provide them with supportive or loving care and oftentimes may even mistreat them. Many also experience inadequate support from professionals working within an under-resourced system that are charged with protecting them. To explore emerging adults' experiences with moral injury, we asked 4 questions. Question 1. Do emerging adults report experiences of moral injury associated with events surrounding their child welfare involvement? Question 2. If so, what events do they describe as morally injurious? Question 3. When do these events occur in development? And our final question, are there variations in the types of moral injury described across development? We used a mixed methods designed to combine quantitative measures and qualitative life story narratives suitable for studying populations whose lives and stories have been historically marginalized or ignored. We recruited 28 emerging adults in 4 Midwestern states with culturally diverse voices and child welfare service experiences. In Illinois, child welfare services are administered and supervised by the state. There are no federally recognized tribes. In Minnesota, child welfare services are state supervised and administered by the counties. They also involve 2 indigenous tribes. In Michigan, child welfare services are state supervised and administered, and they also collaborate with 12 tribes. In South Dakota, Child Protection Services, or CPS, are administered and supervised by the state, which also serves 5 of 9 indigenous tribes. Young adults who participated in our study provided individual face-to-face sessions lasting anywhere from 40 to 90 minutes. To analyze our data, we examined participants' characteristics and the extent they experienced moral injury related to events surrounding and including their child welfare involvement. We transcribed interviews verbatim, and we induced themes describing morally injurious events through repeated readings of the transcript. And then we investigated group differences in the level of moral injury among participants expressing particular themes by using the MEAS. Participants were from a variety of cultural communities. They ranged in age from 18 to 25 years old. On average, they entered care at 6.5 years of age and experienced approximately 8 placements. Most of the participants aged out of foster care. Most had at least a high school diploma. Many were still students. Most reported incomes below the federal poverty level, and about a third were parents. This upcoming section is about the quantitative analysis results. This table shows participants' MEAS scores. You'll see that the levels of moral injury reported on the MEAS are at least as high as military samples from previous studies. The total MEAS score for all 3 subscales were above the scale's midpoint. This table shows specific items. Of the 28 emerging adults, you will notice that, on average, all items are endorsed above the scale midpoint, and that all but item number 4 are endorsed above the scale midpoint by the majority of the participants. This table presents the specific events participants described as morally injurious. Most participants described some form of maltreatment as morally injurious. Many reported multiple types of maltreatment. Psychological abuse was the most frequent form reported, and physical abuse was just under that, followed by sexual abuse and the exploitation of labor. This table presents the next most frequently cited category of moral injury, which is failure to protect. Many participants cited some form of failure to protect, and many reported multiple types of it. Some examples include an authority figure not helping or protecting a child, including a foster parent not intervening when a child is being physically abused, an authority figure not believing or listening to the child, such as a caseworker or educator discounting a child's report of maltreatment or another significant problem. And a third example is abandonment. Something like one participant described a mother leaving their child to be raised by maltreating relatives so that she could follow her boyfriend to another state. This table presents injury of identity by number of participants and multiple incidents reported. We can see that these injuries have in common the young person's experience of being disrespected as an individual or a member of a family or a cultural community. For example, failure to inform. A young man described that no one informed him of the death of his father from complications of substance abuse. Another example is a school counselor violated the confidentiality of a participant and disclosed the status of being a foster child to others at school. A third example is another participant reported that his name had been changed despite his objections. This table presents participants who experienced multiple episodes of moral injury. Most participants, about 26%, reported multiple distinct episodes of moral injury, and we can see that 43% of participants reported 4 or more episodes. Among these 43%, 7% of the participants reported 8 distinct episodes or more of moral injury. This table shows the ages of participants when they experienced morally injurious events. You'll notice participants recalled moral injury occurring from early childhood through emerging adulthood. Most participants described moral injury in mid and early adolescence. Some, 11 of our 28 participants, even recalled morally injurious events occurring between the ages of 3 and 5 years old. This table shows us moral injury reported over time. Most participants described morally injurious events that were sustained or repeated over years. 39% of participants also described moral injury sustained or repeated over months. And many described events that were sustained or reported over years. One example is a participant endured a psychologically and physically abusive foster home from middle childhood to middle adolescence. As mentioned previously, in our research we used the MEAS to measure and examine transgression of self, transgression of others, and betrayal. This slide presents an analysis of our mixed methods results. As you can see, participants who described adults' failure to protect scored significantly higher on the item transgression of others compared to those who did not report that failure. Participants who reported moral injury of identity scored significantly higher on the total MEAS compared to those who didn't. Participants who reported more than 3 episodes of morally injurious events scored significantly higher on the total MEAS, as well as the subscales transgression of others and betrayal. Mann-Whitney tests revealed that participants who reported moral injury in their early childhood or middle childhood scored higher on the betrayal subscale than those who didn't. And participants who disclosed moral injury in their late adolescence scored significantly higher on the total MEAS and the subscales transgression of self and others. Participants who reported moral injury that was sustained or repeated over years also scored significantly higher on the subscale transgression of others than those who did not report such experiences. Our case study is of Maya. Maya's life story illustrates a failure to protect and multiple other moral injuries, including psychological abuse and the failure to listen. Maya is a single 23-year-old Latina. At the time of her interview, Maya was a college student and worked as a student support professional. She entered foster care at 3 months of age, and over the course of her childhood and adolescence, she was in traditional foster care for a total of 12 years and had 23 different placements. In responding to the MEAS, she strongly agreed with transgression of others and betrayal. She felt betrayed both by social workers and parents. When asked to elaborate on the MEAS, Maya described multiple instances of moral injuries. 2 events, however, were the most troubling for her. The first occurred when she was 16. The situation involved a psychological abuse of a young foster brother by the foster father and the foster mother's failure to protect the child. In Maya's own words, the foster father locked the 7-year-old in the laundry room, and from his past trauma, he was scared of the dark. He shouldn't have been locked in the laundry room. It was mostly troubling because the foster mother didn't intervene. She came home and didn't want to stand up to her husband. After he walked away, I opened the door and I calmed my foster brother down. And then my foster mother thanked me, but she still wanted the little boy to apologize, which felt really uncomfortable. Then I encouraged him to apologize just so that things wouldn't get any worse for him. The second example involved the behavior of her alcoholic biological mother, but most troubling was the failure of social services and legal professionals to listen to her when she repeatedly requested to forego visits with her mom, who she correctly predicted would be intoxicated during her visits. She subsequently resorted to threatening to physically harm her mom to avoid future visits, which she experienced as a transgression of self. In Maya's own words, I strongly advocated to the best of my abilities that I did not want to start visitations with my birth mother because I had heard that she had relapsed after my grandfather passed, and our visits was supposed to be 2 days after his funeral. I just didn't want to see her like that. My guardian ad litem and the judge, when I said I wanted to refuse the visit, told me that it would be held against me. I was told that I had to, and my mom showed up to the facility intoxicated. However, the caseworkers that were going to supervise did not, I guess, screen my mother. And so the first time me seeing my mother after 13 years, she was completely intoxicated. And it was upsetting. I hardly recognized her. I just lost my grandfather, and here she is. I can't even grieve with her. She's just so out of it. And she broke down at times because she was drunk, and I had to comfort her. And it was just really a difficult 25 minutes. I just felt disappointed and hurt, but disappointed in the caseworkers and the system because I already knew that my mother wasn't going to show up sober. I was refusing the visit for a purpose, and they weren't listening. And the only way I could get them to not have me have another visit was to threaten my mom. I told them that if they put me in a room with her again, that I would hurt her, and I wouldn't have. I would have been upset, but I had to say a violent thing because they weren't taking my natural emotional pain and struggle seriously. It was sad that the system failed. Having lost my mom, I feel bad that I've said those things now. Our study makes two primary contributions to our emerging understanding of moral injury. First, we focus the discussion of moral injury on emerging adults aging out of foster care. These young people are among our most vulnerable because they are at increased risk for a wide range of problematic outcomes. Findings suggest that moral injury is yet another burden many emerging adults with foster care histories carry with them into adulthood. A second contribution of this study is the examination of morally injurious events in developmental contexts. We found that even very young children possess basic moral frameworks, and they can be violated through intentional, harmful maltreatment. An individual's vulnerability to various morally injurious events, however, likely changes with their development. Reflecting this vulnerability, we found that participants' report of adults' failure to protect in childhood were positively associated with their ME scores on transgression of others. We also found that adolescence and emerging adulthood is a time of rapid identity development. Reflecting the significance of our identity development to our emerging adults, the study shows that participants who reported injury of identity scored significantly higher on the total MEs and transgression of others compared to those who didn't. Our developmental perspective also focuses attention of experiences over time. Nearly all participants reported morally injurious events across childhood and adolescence that were sustained or repeated across years. This experience of sustained repeated moral injuries was associated with higher MEs subscores on the transgression of others. 68% of participants also described experiences of moral injury from witnessing the maltreatment of foster and biological siblings. The subscale transgression of others was significantly higher for participants who reported other children as the targets of morally injurious events than those who didn't. The primary limitation of the study is the retrospective nature of participants' accounts. Future research should consult children and adolescents, ideally using a longitudinal design. In addition, more research is needed to fully examine the micro and macro contexts in which vulnerabilities to moral injury emerge. Our subsequent papers will explore developmental changes in the meanings of morally injurious events, as well as strategies for coping and healing from them. Finally, multivariate analyses will be needed to interpret the associations described in this study. Previous research indicates that many young people with child welfare histories experience high rates of trauma exposure. Previous research indicates that many young people with child welfare histories experience high rates of trauma exposure. Progress has been made in providing trauma-informed care to these young people. Our current research indicates that former foster youth also may experience moral injury, either co-occurring or independently of trauma. Policymakers and providers of services should consider this and require additional intervention strategies. Congratulations! You've completed Module 1 of 2. Check the CASHU website for the second module of moral injury. You can also visit the website to print out confirmation of completion for CEUs.